She tried pulling herself back, but however hard she tried, however hard she pushed, she could not stop her feet from dragging towards the open window. She dug her heels in the wooden floor, feeling splinters coming off it as her feet dragged her onward. Her hand caught the windowsill and the wind blew in her face, causing her to whip around. Her eyes widened with helpless and terror, taking in the navy blue sky with its sad, gray moon and uneven sprinkling stars. She couldn't move her head, but she turned her pleading eyes to him as he stood beneath her. "Please!" The word caught her throat, her voice choked with fear. He looked back intently into her eyes, that smile fixed on his lips as he tied the thick rope around the window ledge. It all started 3 weeks ago. She had woken up to a sudden tapping on her window. Ignoring it, thinking it was the wind playing tricks, she went back to sleep. The light tapping the window became deliberate knocking the next time. She sat shivering with fright in her bed, unable to move until the knocking ceased. However, the next morning, she was sure that she had been imagining things. Her room was on the 3rd floor with no trees or drain piping outside to provide access to unwelcomed intruders. It wasn't knocking, anyway, she convinced herself. It must have been one of many mystery sounds the night weaves into its lullaby. 2 days passed. As she was sculpting downstairs in her studio, she heard the knock again. For a second, she froze with fright. Then she turned. Outside the window, hanging upside down, was a little boy, only his head was visible through the glass. His face extremely pale, his hair dark, long and dirty. He could have been a street urchin, had it not been for his eyes. The eyes weren't human. They were round and slanted with impossibly large irises. He gave her a mischief smile and tapped the window again, still upside down. "Please, lady," he said, "won't you let me in?" She gasped and stumbled backwards, knocking her incomplete sculpture to the ground, throwing flakes of clay everywhere, for the child spoke in the voice of a man, a husky, sadistic tone. He started visiting her more and more, often knocking at doors and windows. No, she thought, don't let him in. Whatever you do, don't let him in. She would see him peeking from her window locked. She ignored the knocking that continued, followed by his voice. "Please, lady, won't you let me in?" She started getting paranoid. It was the great inner turmoil that she left house for work every day. For the most part, things appeared normal, until that particular day. That day she was already feeling slightly sick due to the lack of sleep. Her coworker had suggested that she talk to somebody, a therapist, a priest maybe. Yes, she thought, I will today. Suddenly, someone knocked at her car window. She gasped, her pupils dilated in horror. It was a cop. She had parked in front of a no parking sign. Swearing, she reared out and parked again, rushing out to go to work. The cafe she worked at was a small glass-walled haven for all kind of people, readers, lovers, and businessmen who wanted a cup of tea or coffee before they bustled back to their offices. It was an hour before she would get off. She was serving a table by a huge glass wall when a whisper reached her ears. "Hey, lady," it said. Abruptly, she looked out the window, and there he stood, right in the middle of the road, with his black, slanting eyes and wicked smile. Without thinking, she rushed out into the sidewalk, and he was still there, right in the middle of the busy road with the traffic whizzing past him. "I said please, didn't I?" the boy whispered. "I am a good boy, lady," came the man's voice from the little boy's throat. "I said please." He stood 12 feet away, and still his voice sounded in her ears, above the noise of the traffic, as clearly as he was inside of her own head. And the bus sped over him, just like that, passed right over the spot where he was standing. She screamed and ran into the traffic where he had been, but nothing was there. She went on her knees on the hard gray road. A few bypassers stopped to try and calm her as she sobbed. It took her a while to get back to her senses. She got into the car and sped off towards home as fast as she could. She rushed straight upstairs, right into her bedroom, and splashed her face with cold water. She looked at her face in the mirror, skull-like and gaunt now. "What have you done to yourself?" she asked. "You're going insane," she thought. "Don't let this happen. Don't lose your mind." She dried her face and turned into the bathroom. She was just inside the room when she stopped in her tracks. There he was, sitting at the window ledge, his short, skinny legs dangling inside. "You left the window open," the husky voice purred. And then he walked to her side, took her hand in his tiny cold one, and started pulling her towards the window with surprising strength. Though she struggled, she couldn't fight him off. She watched him tying the rope on the ledge in one end, and on the other, a noose. "Please," she managed to croak out. "I said please too," the sadistic voice crooned as he lovingly placed the noose around her neck. She felt her feet climb the window ledge, and then she was standing on it. "I am a good, good boy," the voice whispered in her ear. She felt his cold breath, protrude smell, the smell of death. I used to look out the rusted iron bars of my window and dream about being a bird. The chain that shackled me to my bed was just long enough to reach the windowsill, so every night after my father would visit my room, I would lie awake and wait for the first rays of light to creep over the horizon, then walk over to my window and listen to the morning's first few notes of birdsong. Their melodies were so beautiful I knew that they must have been singing about places far away and wonderful, about sailing on the wind through endless blue skies, looking down at the treetops that dotted the land below. Then, one morning, as I lay in bed, something impossible happened. I had fallen asleep the night before and would have missed my morning birdsong but for a tapping on my window. I rubbed the sleep out of my eyes and sat up to see a crow sitting out on the windowsill, tapping my window with its beak. I crept over to the window and smiled at the bird. "Hello, Mr. Crow," I said. "Hello, little girl," said the crow. I stood there, dumbfounded for a moment, not knowing what to say. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, I forced myself to speak. You know how to talk?" I said. "All birds know how to talk," he replied. "It's just not all humans know how to listen." I pushed my window open a crack until he hit against the bars. The bird cocked its head in curiosity. "Why are you in a cage?" I asked. "It's my destiny," I said. "It's always been this way." "You look rather thin," replied the crow. "Would you like something to eat?" My stomach gave a weak growl. "Yes," I said. "That would be wonderful." Without another word, the crow took off. A few moments later, he returned with a branch of figs. The crow watched me as I greedily devoured the fruit. After I had finished, he stared at me for a moment before speaking again. "I didn't know they put people in cages," he said. "Do you think they mistook you for a bird?" "I don't think so, Mr. Crow," I said. We wailed away the rest of the day talking. The crow told me all about what it was like to fly, how there was no better feeling in the world. He told me about the faraway lands that he had visited when he was a young bird and could still make the journey north when changing of the seasons. Finally, evening came and the crow said that he had to go. The next morning he was back, however, with 2 more branches of figs. I thanked him for his generosity and we talked another day away. That day he even sang me a song. He didn't have a voice for singing, but I thought his song was beautiful anyway. We passed the entire fall that way. The bird's visits became the only bright side of my life. He brought me not only figs, but cherries and walnuts too. Anything small enough for him to carry. Soon, however, winter came, and with the frost that destroyed the figs and cherries that the crow had used to bring me, his gifts became fewer and fewer, and I could tell from his tired voice that he was flying farther and farther away to get them. One morning, when the first snows of winter had fallen, the crow asked me a question. "What would you do to leave this place?" he asked, cocking his head to the side. I thought for a moment, but I wasn't sure how to answer. Finally, I told the truth. "I would do anything to leave this place," I said. "Anything at all." The crow solemnly nodded and said, "The frost isn't the only thing that winter brings." He flapped his wings once and jumped from the windowsill, and I didn't see him for 3 days. I began to fall into a deep depression. Every morning I would still listen to the bird song, but it sounded forlorn and empty without my friend there to listen with me. The morning after the 3rd day, my crow friend returned. It was a beautiful day that day. The sun had come from behind the clouds to melt the snow, one of the last green days before winter had come earnest. As the shadow passed over the valley in which we lived, I first mistook it for a storm cloud, but then I heard the sound. It was loud enough to crack the sky, but it wasn't thunder, it was birds. Thousands upon thousands of them descended onto our house. A whirling storm of beating wings and shrieking claws. They crashed into the walls and windows, pegging at them with wild ferocity. The house shook under their assault, and their calls were so loud that I didn't even hear the windows breaking. They were not so loud, however, that I could not hear my father scream. It was over in a matter of minutes, and the key to my shackles slipped under the door. I rushed over and picked it up with trembling hands, sliding it into the metal cuff around my ankle and turning it. The cuff came loose with a heavy click, and for the first time I was free. The key to the door slipped under the jamb as well, and I opened the door to the rest of the house. The place had been all but destroyed. There was splintered wood and broken glass everywhere, and in the center of the living room was what remained of my father, a pile of blood-shed feathers. The birds had all flown off, but Mr. Crow sat on top of the living room fireplace, regarding me with a curious look. "Now you can fly free, little girl," he said. "No more cages for you." "Thank you, Mr. Crow," I said. "Will you come with me?" Mr. Crow shook his head. "I am an old bird," he said, "and my journey is coming to a close. But yours is just beginning." Mr. Crow flapped his wings and took flight, and I never saw him again. As I stepped out of the front door, my bare feet touched the grass for the very first time, and I could smell flowers on the breeze as it drifted over me. At that moment, though my feet were firmly on the ground, my heart was soaring through endless blue sky, far above the world that I had left behind. I still wake up every morning to hear the birds sing, and when the first few notes break the silence of the early dawn, I think of Mr. Crow and smile. You've asked me to keep a journal, Father O'Brien, so here it is. It seems that relocating to Maryland was a waste. Moving from one house to another doesn't seem to stop anything, and the police are at a loss. If you are unable to help us, the easiest path towards is just giving up hope. Hope hurts too much if there is no faith to lift its wings. Day 1, our first night on Hill Street, did not offer any peace. The constant ticking of the clock was inaudible from every room in the house. We don't own a clock. Day 2, Georgia, 5 years old, and our youngest, smiled and handed me a piece of paper. "I drew a picture, Daddy," she offered with an impish grin. I took it from her to inspect it. The page was blank. "Georgia, my little sweetheart, this is a blank page," I explained softly. She stamped her feet. "It's not blank, Daddy. It's a picture of our family. Put it on the fridge." Georgia almost never yells, so this concerned me greatly, but that paled in comparison to what it felt like when I looked down at her and saw that she had no eyes. I should say, rather, that the whites of her eyes were in place, but nothing more. Her pupils and irises were gone, only vivid, veiny tendrils of red, crisscrossed, and alabaster surface. Georgia did not seem to notice that they were gone. She grew louder and continued to yell. I slammed the paper on the surface of the refrigerator and shakily affixed a magnet to it. When I looked back at my daughter, her eyes had returned. She was smiling. "Thank you, Daddy," she chirped before skipping down the hall. Day 3. I had gotten out of bed in the middle of the night for a glass of water. I can't explain it perfectly, but humans do have a certain amount of echolocation at their disposal. Something about the way the house sounded was off. I stepped into the darkened living room with the hopes of elevating my fear, but the discomfort only grew. I fumbled for a light switch and flicked it on. The entire room was upside down. All of the furniture was affixed to the ceiling as though it were most natural state in the world. Lights illuminated the scene before me and shining upwards from the ground. After staring for several seconds, I decided that the best approach was to turn the lights back off. This way, at least, I wouldn't have to see it. The rest of the house was, or at least felt, right side up. The living room appears normal in the daylight. Day 4. The locusts are bad this year. Every garden in the block has wilt except for ours. We planted tulips, but only snowdrops are growing. I have to mow the lawn twice a day to keep it from getting overrun. Day 5. A box arrived in the mail today. It had my name on it, written in a child's handwriting. There was no return address. Inside the box were 1,913 human teeth. Day 6. The refrigerator is now completely covered with drawings that Georgia has given me. Every single one of them is blank. Day 7. I get up before the rest of the family and every day to inspect the house. The interior was fine this morning, though I did avoid the living room light. I no longer look into that room before dawn. There were footprints outside the door. The prints formed a long, muddy trail from the street. They appear to come from a man's shoe. At least the first ones did. As the prints get closer to the house, they become gradually elongated. First 12 inches, then 13, 14, a foot and a half, and finally 2 feet long. The last 2 prints on the front door were the width of my torso, and as long as I am tall. Day 7. I am typing this on my laptop in bed. My wife is calling me softly and patiently from the living room. Her voice is coming from the ceiling. I'm too afraid to go out there. Tell me, Father, what happens after the 7th day? The water is perfect this time of night. Shanna lifted her long, white dress over her thin shoulders and dipped under the cold depths of Lake Diamond. Don't be such a baby, Freeman. We didn't come all the way out here at 2 a.m. for nothing. She smiled when she spoke. I loved that. After 5 months of sulking through Stanford High senior year, Shanna looked so absolutely amazing when she finally just smiled. It was stupidly simple. Not too hot, not too warm. The Goldilocks zone. She tilted her tendrils of waterlogged black hair to the side, attempting to shake some of the fresh lake out of her ears as she floated effortlessly in the waves. Do you know the reference? I did. They say something lives at the bottom of the lake. Have you heard that story? I did. She lowered her shy green eyes with a sly grin as she spit some water at me. It's real deep here. Most people don't even know how deep. I pulled off my shirt and stepped over the missing planks of the old wooden dock. Did you know that? She asked. I did. Well, Mr. Freeman, it does appear you know everything, Shanna replied with a shocking shout. I do, I replied before jumping in like a cannonball, shamelessly spraying water into her eyes. I reached out to grab her, and she played like she was putting up a fight. I kissed her neck softly, and it tasted like perfume and sweat. Are you scared to be here tonight, Mikey? She asked while staring straight ahead. As if in the response to the words, a weak wind picked up in the willow trees surrounding the coast. The branches swung back and forth lazily as storms started passing through. Tiny droplets of rain, discarded leaves, dotted the lazy drifting winds as we struggled to stay above the surface. A little, I admitted. My mom used to say I get seasick. You can't get seasick on a lake, Michael, Shanna said in a daze. She stared at something beneath the shore. Did you know people have died here? I didn't. It was never in the papers. So you don't know everything. Her tone turned cold and lonely. My grandfather did, in 1875. He was swimming here, in the middle of the night. The same as he had done 1,000,000 times before. Same as we are doing now. She paused. This shitty dock is ours, after all. His wife always said he needed to get more use out of it. Sounds like a good reason to get out of the lake, Shanna, I said, insistent and confused. Let's go. She stared at me from the bottom of the ladder and shook her head. She was soaking wet and stunned by the significance of something. I could not see beyond the trees. He drowned. I was with him. What are you talking about? Grandpa told me he could do it. We saw a bright light under the waves. It was so warm. It was beautiful and comforting and perfect all at the same time. But so strange. Where did it come from? What did it want? It was like somebody turned on a heater on the lake floor. It didn't make any sense. Nothing she said was making sense anymore. I was just an innocent 17-year-old kid, hoping to score the hottest girl in school. I wanted to touch it, the light. Grandpa said he would swim at the bottom to get it for me. He held his breath real big and went to look, like this. Shanna disappeared. Motherfucker, this is not funny, I screamed to an empty night. I looked around, no one was nearby. I reached underwater and caught a flailing foot. She surfaced with entangled limbs and hopeful screams. Can you see it? She slapped my face as I tried to pull her away from the waves. Look! I did. A bright luminescent light underneath the surface. It was absurd, and exactly as she described. The light encompassed every inch of the storm-fused lake. I leaped into the deck and grabbed Shanna by the arm. As I started to pull her towards me, she pulled back with a surprising force. I landed back in the water with a belly flop. She wrapped her thin arms around my shoulders. Grandpa never came back. I hope you do. Shanna kissed me, the same as she had done 1,000 times. But something was different. Her lips were dry and crackled. A warm and sticky liquid flooded over her teeth and into her mouth. I opened my eyes and spit out the liquid. It was blood redder than her underwear. Then she had dunked my head without any explanation. The light was pulsating at that point. I could see it even through my closed eyes. I screamed, but water filled my lungs. After it felt like there was no fight in me left, something relented as I broke the surface. But the face in front of mine was not the one I recognized. She still wore the same bikini top. It was crimson red with tiny little hearts rounded the corners, but the skin behind it was old and gray. Layers of it raised up to form complicated wrinkles on her chest and arms. Her teeth were decaying, that illustrious black hair was falling out by the root. As I looked into her eyes, they were still the same color green. "I need the light, Mike. Go get me the fucking light." Every voice was different. It was tired, old, and angry. A neighbor must have heard the commotion. He opened his door a few hundred feet away and called out into the dark, "Are you kids all right? It's too late for swimming." "No," I shouted. "Please help me." When I turned to face Shannon, she was gone. The lake was dark again. A dive crew searched Diamond's grounds for hours. They never found my girlfriend or anything that suggested an electrical source. The body of the deceased senior citizen washed up on the shore next morning. I kept my mouth shut, even though the revealed answer of my own haunting question for sure. Shanna really did need the light that night. When I was a child, there was nothing to eat. I was the eldest of 5, so it was my job to make sure that I always let my brothers and sisters eat before me. War was inching inward from the coast, and as it marched closer, our food grew scarcer. Animals fled the area or were slaughtered and consumed in panic by other families in our village. My father was a wise, cautious man, and so we waited to slaughter our 2 chickens until the fall, when grass and tree had become too hard to find or inedible. The other families knew we had chickens, and father stayed up all night, every night, to watch over them. He had to kill at least one boy from a neighboring town who had gone mad with hunger and tried burning down our small home with a burning branch. When the chickens were naught but bones, and the bones had grown brittle and porous from my mother's many soups, my parents sent my 2 eldest siblings and I out to collect bugs and field mice for supper. We were hungry, but not quite starving, until one morning we woke up to the first frost, and there was nothing alive left to eat. My parents began to discuss the inevitable. Perhaps my father should go to the coast and sell his pocket watch to one of the drunken but well-paid soldiers. It was the only thing we had of value and the only family heirloom my father had to pass down to me. I didn't want him to go. I was afraid war would arrive while he was gone, and I was too young and too weak to protect my mother and younger siblings. I begged him to stay, but he insisted it would be all right and promised to be back within 2 weeks. I was so scared that when he and my mother were outside preparing his satchel, I smashed the pocket watch under my foot and placed it back at my father's half-rotted desk. My mother cried for days. Father did his best to comfort her as I watched them peel the leather from my father's boots and boil the hide for dinner. The next night, Mother found a dead rat and boiled away the disease with the new fallen snow from outside. The next evening, she filled our bellies with rat bones and more melted snow. My little brother Albert kept everyone awake that night, crying over his hunger. He begged for all the things we'd eaten when we had a garden, animals, beef stew, white rolls, succulent corn, and spiced lamb. He made all of our stomachs moan and torture us, and I soon screamed at him to be quiet while Mother sobbed in her room. Father stroked Albert's hair for hours, then went back into Mother's bedroom, shutting the door behind him. Albert moaned until the thin light of dawn peeked through our thread-bar curtains. I could hear Father in his room tinkering with the watch. My hunger had long worn out of my fear of soldiers, and I silently prayed that he could repair it. Father worked on the pocket watch all through the day and night. Celia had found dead crickets in the wall in the abandoned bakery, and as we ate them, Father emerged from his bedroom with Mother right behind him. The smile on his face was one I had almost forgotten, as I had not seen it since the day my youngest sister was born. He told us that he had repaired Grandfather's watch and that he had heard a soldier encampment nearby. 3 days, he promised us. 3 days I will return with carrots, lamb, and rolls so big they'll fill your bellies for a year. We clapped our hands in delight and ran our small yet dirty yard with a glim that felt a foreign language to us. Father said that we were all to help Mother find beautiful things which to dress the table. The next morning he gave us a piece of rubber from the sole of Mother's shoe to chew on, and sent us on our mission after kissing us goodbye and promising to be back before we remembered he'd left. We had such fun that day, gathering horseshoes and shards of broken glass. We threaded bits of twine through the horseshoes to hang over the table and tied the glass to the ends, hoping they would shimmer in the lamplight. We returned home as the sun set, happy with our day's work and eager to return tomorrow. We weren't yet inside of home when we first smelled it: onions, chicken broth, spiced lamb, and even sweets. I ran as fast as I could, dropping our table dressings carefully along the way in my maddened pursuit for food. I bursted through the door to find Mother at the stove, preparing our meal in a quiet reverence. I threw my arms around her and asked if Father was home already. Yes, love. He had the fortunate chance of meeting a wealthy mercenary on the road who was only too happy to buy her grandfather's watch. I hugged her even tighter and sat down at the table as my brothers and sisters came spilling through the doorway. They found their places quickly, hungrily expectant looks upon their faces. Father came out of the bedroom and took his seat at the end of the table as Mother brought over a steaming platter of spice-boiled lamb. She nodded at us. We filled our hands with the rich meat, hardly bothering with our plates. After dinner we were sent to bed with full tummies. Barely a word had been said by anyone since our food had been set on the table. We ate our fill the next night, and then the next, and then the next. But as our food stock started to dwindle, so did Mother's health. Each day bled out until we were fighting over scraps of raw meat while our mother lay weak and wilting nearby. The first night I went again without food was the night the hazy, happy ether began to lift from my memories of the past 3 days became confusing. I recall that the spice lamb I consumed with such ferocity had actually been sickly sweet, and the accompaniments I had first smelled from afar had never been brought to the table. I couldn't remember Mother eating anything all the days since Father had returned. Instead, she sat quickly next to us at the table, staring at a pile of gray meat we consumed with such fever. And Father, I couldn't recall hearing his voice since the morning he had left for the soldiers' encampment. His chair had sat empty night after night, and as the preparables of my memory formed shape, I couldn't be entirely sure he had ever been there at all, at least not since the morning he had cut pieces of rubber from Mother's shoes at the table. Frightened and starved, I didn't sleep until the darkest hours of the night. The following morning, when Mother emerged from her room, I asked where Father had gone. She told me he had left to become a soldier and sent us out to peel bark off the bushes in the forest. Father never returned. Perhaps the reason I didn't realize what happened back then was because it was too awful to consider, and I was so very hungry. But Mother died a few days ago. In death, she thrusted the truth upon me. From her stock of meager possessions, I was bequeathed a small box that contained nothing more than a shiny, broken pocket watch. Perhaps she wanted me to remember it all, the only hope of our survival I'd smash under my heel. My father's last, loving hug before he sent us to collect dressings for the feast. The overly seasoned gray meat and the rancid smell had begun wafting out from under my mother's door, becoming more pungent each day. My father sacrificed more for his family than most ever would. I used to lament that I had nothing to remember him by. No family heirloom to pass down to my own children. But now that I have his pocket watch, a thing that I cannot give to my children, not because the glass is shattered, not because the gears are cracked. I cannot part with the watch because it is a curse that I must bear, for the shiny, contoured metal has never lost the sickening smell of that sweet, silvery meat.